From Russia with love. A plane load of ventilators, masks and respirators landed in New York yesterday. A propaganda coup for the Russian leader, and more evidence that the supposed superpower is floundering, not leading. COVID-19 is a global threat, but no one is spearheading a global response. It's an international problem in a world of competing nationalisms.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Which country would look to the US for leadership now?
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak with you.
To a president who refers to the virus as generally foreign or specifically Chinese.
That started in China and is now spreading throughout the world.
And stopped flights to Europe without even warning EU leaders.
This is a global pandemic.
The German Chancellor famously confronted President Trump at a meeting of G7 economic powers in 2018. But where is the G7 now? Virtual G7 meetings have ended with no binding communique, partly because the US insisted on referring to the Wuhan virus after the Chinese city where it emerged.
Every one of the nations that was at that meeting this morning was deeply aware of the disinformation campaign that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in to try and deflect from what has really taken place here.
A virtual meeting of the G20 was equally ineffectual, and the European Commission President was scathing about EU countries refusing to share equipment, coordinate movement restrictions, or agree a common financial response.
When Europe really needed to be there for each other, too many initially looked out for themselves. When Europe really needed an all-for-one spirit, too many initially gave an only-for-me response.
Hi folks, I want to bring you up to speed with something that's happening today, which is that I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus.
The UK, which with Brexit chose to self-isolate before that was even a thing, is not looked to for leadership these days. And the United Nations, created after World War II to combat global threats, has been sidelined by a generation of leaders turning inwards.
I ask myself every single day, is there something I could do that would save lives and make a difference?
Arguably, President Obama abrogated US leadership by choosing not to intervene in the war in Syria. Today, China, even more than Russia, is seizing the ground that the US has ceded. China has sent aid to Europe, portraying itself as a global saviour after initially covering up the outbreak in Wuhan and then blaming the US for spreading the disease. Such a contrast to the Ebola epidemic in 2014, when the US was a clear leader, sending troops and medical supplies to Liberia, building hospitals, helping to reduce fatalities and stop the spread. Or to 2009, when then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, credited with leading an effective global response to the financial crisis, convened the G20 summit in London. It was held in, of all places, the XL Centre, now the Nightingale Hospital, where thousands of NHS staff are preparing for a coronavirus surge.
Now, in the first of two former world leaders' interviews, I spoke to Jose Manuel Barroso, former president of the EU Commission, and I asked him whether the pandemic had exposed the European Union's weaknesses as member countries closed their borders to each other and struggled to cooperate.
Well, the European Union itself is not the problem. The problem are some governments that do not let the European Union do what she should be doing. So the European institutions as such have been reacting, I believe, in a swift and determined manner. The European Central Bank took unprecedented measures, not only in terms of the amounts that they are committing to quantitative easing and to the monetary support, but also in terms of changing also their internal rules, and so advocating a policy of no limits. This took almost 4 years in the last crisis. Now it took less than 3 weeks. I continue to think that in these current circumstances, most likely, there will be no consensus about corona bonds or euro bonds. That could certainly be, from an ideal point of view, the best solution, because it will be joint and several emission of European or Eurozone debt. That could be a much stronger signal. But let's be realistic. The European Union, it's a union of now 27 countries, the Eurozone 19 countries, and they have different approaches. So at the end, like it happens usually in the European Union, there will be a compromise, I think, and the compromise will probably be around a renewed role or with some increased flexibility for the European stability mechanism. But let's put things in perspective. Would European countries be better if there was not a European Union? If there was a full renationalization of policies? So in political terms, we have always to think counterfactually. What is alternative? Will the alternative be better? I'm sure it will not be. So the European Union has its flaws, but at the end it works. So what we have to ask is the governments of Europe to be more supportive of a common approach.
Is that a diplomatic way of saying Germany can't be expected to pay for everybody?
At the head of government, in this case, the Chancellor of Germany, by the way, someone I respect very much, Angela Merkel, first of all, she has to get the support of her own, let's say, citizens. So at the same time, I understand fully the concerns of Italy, of Prime Minister Conte or Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain. They are facing a tragedy. I mean, it's a tragedy. It's a humanitarian tragedy. I understand them fully. And I also understand the concerns of other countries that are not in the same difficult situation from a health point of view, but are concerned mainly about the economic and social impact of this situation.
When you look at the United States, China, and the European Union right now, is there any hope for global leadership?
It's difficult. It's difficult because I think there was already a trend before this crisis, a kind of a decoupling, namely around issues of trade, but also technology, namely between the United States and China. So the European Union, of course, has its own problems. It's first of all to have a common, coherent position, but without a commitment, a strong commitment of the United States. They are, in spite of everything people say, they are still the most important power in the world. If you think about economic and geopolitical or military terms. And the reality is that the American leadership has not shown the same commitment to a global order that it has shown before. And when the leader of the most important country in the world says, my country first, of course, the temptation is to say the same. So, and that creates more difficulties for a coherent, coordinated, cooperative, global response. Certainly, I think there was at the beginning some kind of underestimation of the seriousness of this crisis, as we have seen. But I think now, most generally speaking, governments are really committed in fighting, above all, what is a truly dramatic humanitarian emergency.
Mr. Barroso, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, in the second of our interviews with former world leaders, earlier I spoke to former director of the World Health Organization and ex-Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, and I began by asking her if she was worried that every country has taken different measures to combat the virus.
I do support those countries who have taken strong action early. And although China, made a great mistake in the beginning weeks not to report early enough, it certainly then, as it started spreading and they became aware, they have done very strict measures. And you see that this kind of public health attitude and awareness is necessary to make a difference. Other countries have done varied things. I believe those who have done the most effective public health measures are also those that are now in the best shape. For instance, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and also some of the Nordic countries have really, taken action in the last few weeks.
Do you think that it will be the developing countries, particularly the African continent and Latin America, who may suffer most from all this?
Yes, and this is why from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, we have put out, an urgent action request for funding, because countries really need support, and early, to try to prevent a worse situation than it would otherwise be. And, since the economy is so affected in many countries, this is a major economic and financial crisis. And so money has to go to people, to avoid poverty and a lack of food in the poorest countries. And of course, in many countries, this kind of action has already been taken to secure the workforce that is being laid off.
Now, do you think that we Europeans, who've been concentrating very much on the agony of Italy and Spain, will soon be talking about USA, UK, maybe even France?
I think we already are talking about those. And I certainly noticed that your Prime Minister changed course, some time ago. Not belittling the problem, as both he and Trump did for a long time. Trump has been doing that, for weeks. But now he obviously is aware that this crisis is real, is a big catastrophe, also in the US.
Using your own experience, how much longer do you think all this is going to go on?
I'm afraid that the predictions that have been made, that it could last for a year or 1.5 until we have a vaccine, because that's an essential thing, in addition to equipment for health workers and other parts of the preparedness. But we need a vaccine. And of course, that research is now ongoing.
Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, thank you very much indeed for talking with us. Thank you.